Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Redford. I'm the Nasser D. Khalili Professor of Islamic Art and Archaeology at the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London. It's with great pleasure that I introduce you to this wonderful specialist course that we are running thanks to the generosity of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Especially in the person of its director, Farrokh Derakhshani, who is here today. I would, in addition to the Aga Khan Award for Islamic Architecture, I would like to thank my friend and colleague Saif al-Rashidi, who is the, shall we say, who is the person who came up with this idea and came to us here at SOAS with it. To my friend and colleague Saif, who is the executive director of the Barakat Trust for Culture. So it's a wonderful combination of the Barakat Trust for Culture and the Aga Khan Award for Architecture coming together with SOAS to present this wonderful, sort of one of its kind, first of its kind, free at the point of source, course on modern contemporary Islamic architecture, in the entire world. So welcome to the course. I congratulate all of you who have managed to sign up for it, and I wish you the very best in hearing a group of experts and participating in a series of discussions about the theme of the course.
Thank you very much, Scott, for your kind introduction. And thank you, Farrokh, for being with us. One of the things you probably don't know about Farrokh is that he's just arrived off a plane, literally. So we're so happy that he's actually managed to get through the traffic in Athens and be here. And I'm just going to tell you a bit about the course, how we thought about it, and how it's going to run. So the Aga Khan Trust for Culture has an education department which is very keen to promote and raise awareness about the activities of the large Aga Khan Trust for Culture network. SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, is always keen to identify new ways of public education, new fields that complement the courses already on offer. And it was thought that this was a really interesting topic, a really relevant topic. And the Barakat Trust, for which I work, is committed to raising awareness and preserving the heritage of the Islamic world. So together we came up with an 8-session course that would encourage reflection, debate, discussion about contemporary architecture of the Islamic world. And building and interacting with the huge body of knowledge developed by the Aga Khan Award for Architecture over the past 40 years, and other people in the field whose work is really interesting and relevant. And one of the things to think about in the context of this course is we're talking really about contemporary issues. Some contemporary issues change over time, contemporary issues in architecture and the urban environment, some of which, or many of which I would say, are pertinent globally. They're not just relevant to societies with a link to Islam and Muslim culture. But we are looking at solutions, questions, approaches pertaining to societies with connections to Muslim communities and Islam. More than that, the course is also a way of shedding light, of putting the spotlight on thoughtful, intelligent solutions to regional, local, and often global problems and global challenges related to the built environment. And in a way, there's a lot we can learn from the experience of the Aga Khan Award, which has searched rigorously and with great sincerity and depth for exemplars that other people can be inspired by. And so a lot of what we cover in the course is related to finding examples that actually not only provoke debate and thought, but also provide interesting responses and valuable responses. You have the program, but we're also going to, there's an intellectual side, which is also to think about the ideas of modernity and architecture and design, the environment, and how do we respond appropriately to the environment? How do we involve a society or a community in the design process and architecture? How do we approach and challenge and take on the huge challenges of an increasingly urbanized world? What is the notion of identity really, and how is it expressed in architecture in different ways? And of course, concluding with looking towards the future and where do we go from here and where might we go from here? So I'll just tell you a bit about the format. In today's session, we're going to show a very short 1.5 minute film about the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, which will frame today's discussion. Farrokh will talk about the Aga Khan Award and the context in which it came about, one extremely pertinent to this course on contemporary architecture of the Islamic world. And then the last half hour or so will be devoted to questions, discussion, and it's conversational. So you can type your questions in the chat box, and Farrokh and I will answer them, and we'll have a discussion about them. And the format will be repeated 8 times every week at the same time. So we're very happy that you're here. And Farrokh, I'm extremely happy. I'm often told that when I'm supposed to give a talk or a lecture, I always arrive at the last minute. So for the first time, I appreciate how anxious one can be when the main speaker is at risk of being caught in traffic. So we're happy that you are.
Hello. Thanks for the introduction, Saif. My name is Farrokh Derakhshani. I just wanted to just give a little bit more, maybe an introduction to what Saif kindly expressed, that what we're going to discuss is about what's happening in architecture today. And I've put here the date of the 1977 to 2022. This is when the Aga Khan Award for Architecture was created, and then 2022 was the last series of awards which were given, was last year, and it's every 3 years. What's interesting is that to have first to come before we just go into the subject is the time. In the 70s and in the early 80s, when the award was created, the world was like as usual in a change, but it was after the Second World War II changes. It means the big changes of the migration from rural areas and to the cities. All of a sudden, the world had changed for thousands of years. The built environment was growing very slowly. Things were happening very, very slowly, and it was kind of a progressive. But all of a sudden, since the end of the World War II, specifically in the developing countries, the Muslim world. There was a lot of changes with new architecture coming. What was happening is that people who had inherited a very harmonious built environment that they were living, which was supposed to be the symbols of the Islam architecture of the Muslim societies, was what was happening. The reality was what was seeing on the right-hand side. Everywhere was looking alike. And this has been the case in the past so many years. So in the past 40 years, all of a sudden, all the societies, all the cities, all the villages, all the rural areas of the Muslim world started changing. And what we have today, this is the symbol of the modern lives of the Muslim societies. Here, a lot of people have been talking about Dubai in the past so many years, but it's not only Dubai. The rest of the world looks exactly the same thing. What it is a combination of this very high contemporary architecture, which has been especially in the past 20 years, and you cannot see the difference. It's very difficult for you. I'll show you a set of cities, and for you it will be which one is where is it? It was Jakarta. You're in Tehran. You're in Lagos. You're in Cairo. You're in Karachi. Wherever you are, all these places, they look the same. And what they are, we cannot say that there is others. No, these buildings, these countries, these cities are built by the people. Maybe it was together with the other architects and builders coming from the rest of the world. But at the end, the majority has been built by the people from those countries. So what was happening, and I'm going back to this history again, in the late 70s, His Highness the Aga Khan was very worried about how the built environment of the Muslims is changing so fast. And what is happening is that it's very fast. You can't change the space. But what can we do? How can we help to at least have a positive change in it? And that has been the mission of the award since the past 45 years, to do three things, in fact. One was how to protect the past but inspire the future. And the most important thing, how to improve quality of life. And in order to do that, we have to examine, analyze, and understand what's happening and how we can have an influence. So he created the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 1977, and the first awards were given in 1980. Those are the days which the world was, again, going through a series of changes, which Europe, after a period of growth, was starting, especially in architecture. Architects that didn't have that much work and job to do. I'm just coming back from the Venice Biennale, and it's very interesting because it reminded me that in 1982, for the first time ever, the Venice Biennale was dedicated to the Islamic world, Muslim countries. And at those days, they were accused that why maybe they're looking because the money is there. But that was not the whole case. The case was little by little in the 80s, the world started looking at each other. So will not be the limits that it's Eurocentric, it's everything is going to, what's happening is in this part of the world, but people were becoming aware of what's happening in other parts of the world. So His Highness the Aga Khan, what he did in those days, he brought together a series of different people from different backgrounds, architects, scholars, people who were very active, some of you who are old enough like me would know people here like Hassan Fathy or Oleg Grobar, who's a professor, or Charles Correa, and others in this photograph. They helped His Highness the Aga Khan to establish a system which is the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, it's called. And the Aga Khan Award for Architecture is just not an award that you give at the end of the day, so, prizes for some people, but it's a process to how to understand, and as we explained, how to understand and analyze the dynamics of the physical change that we have. So what happened in 1980, those days, you were not talking about many issues, which today in architecture are extremely normal. In 1980, when the first awards were given, people were a little bit surprised, especially in the West, because academia in the West, as well as the practicing architect, because for the first time, all of a sudden, we're putting slum upgrading, engineering, high architecture, which is like the project which is Saudi Arabia by Fry Otto, which unfortunately has been demolished, and the works of Hassan Fathy, all of them together with restorations and other types of architecture. So it means the Aga Khan Award for Architecture started somehow in making the field of architecture to be much more inclusive. But this time, what was happened is that the world was not interested in architecture, the general media. And with the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 1980, all of a sudden, all of the journals, the main newspapers started becoming interested in architecture, talking about architecture of part of the world. And for me, I've always used this image that Domus, which those days and still, and especially in those days, it was only talking about high design, put the face of an Egyptian mason on its cover. That was an eye-opening for many, many people around the world. That first of all, there are others who exist, and they are there, and they are building. And the whole thing is that architecture is not only what was supposed to be those days, the international modern architecture, which was predominant. Little by little, other issues came up, which were as important during the award cycles. For example, we gave awards to housing scheme in Bangladesh, which was done how you create microfinance is in service of housing and providing houses. How can in a country as poor as Bangladesh, with something like $150 that it's given only to women, you can provide housing for you could provide 20,000 houses in a couple of years. At the same time, working with new experiments in the countries that they were forgetting the local material they have, how you can use better the brick in a more innovative way. Or when you were coming to the skyscrapers, and I mean, those are a reality which is happening, but how you could do a better one, which is more fit to the societies that they were. Another subject which now becoming very normal in the discussions of architecture discussions today is about green spaces, etc. In 1995, the Aga Khan Award for Architecture recognized the reforestation of the Meteor University in Ankara, Turkey. And that was a lot of people was asking, but reforestation of planting is not architecture. But today it is an integral part of the discourse of the architects as it is. So I'm just going to go quickly for you to understand how it works. The award it's every 3 years. It's chaired by a steering committee. It's chaired by His Highness the Aga Khan. We have a series of nominators who nominate projects from all around the world for us. And we then, as you saw in the film, we shortlist the projects, and the projects are selected by an independent master jury. So this was a very innovative way of doing things, because what happens is that, first of all, it is done totally by nomination system, which goes, because this way we can discover talents which nobody is aware of them. And we have been, during the past 45 years, we have found many, many new talents in the world of architecture that later became world famous. By sending experts to go and see the projects, this is very innovative, was and still is, because you have to go and see a project. An architectural project is not only the few photos and the drawings that you see. That's why when we have the projects shortlisted, the ones who are at the end, we send an expert to go and talk to the architect, to the client, to the users, to the other people or the peers in the architecture, because a building changes in time. The projects which are only eligible can come to the award are the ones who are completed in use. So we have to make sure that they can live to the promises of the architects and the people of convenience. Second thing, which is very important, no architecture project is the work of an architect. It's always, you have to have the right client, the right builders, the right people, all of them have to be working together to be able to do that. This is just briefly to know that the projects that you would see or have seen, they have been only completed and in use for 1 year, and they have to be in the service of Muslim communities. And that was coming to large that was not like my dear colleague Saif was saying Islamic architecture. There are two words which I never use. I don't use the word Islamic architecture, and I don't use the word the Islamic countries, architecture of Islamic countries. Let's call it the architecture of Muslim societies, because right now the world is changing so fast and people are moving so fast that there's no way that there's something which is that religious can become that. Now, what we have been lucky is that during the past 45 years, we have had most of the people who were involved in architecture throughout the world involved. So I'm showing always this image, not to just drop names, but just to see that the world is one. And that is what we saw this time also. It was interesting in the Venice Biennale with the whole thing. We are not talking about, for example, Africa. When we're talking about Africa, we're talking about the world today. The issues are as important to anyone sitting anywhere, being in London or being in Kuala Lumpur or being in New York or South America. Everything, we are living in a world which is all together. And that's why most of the people who were involved in the built environment have been working with the award during these years and have had an impact on how that this award has been progressing. During this past 7 years, we have had thousands of projects nominated. We've had coming from 101 countries, as you can see. We have organized a number of seminars and meetings all over the world. We've had a number of publications. So what is happening, the reason, it's one of the reasons that SOAS also wanted to use the Aga Khan Award for Architecture examples, because it's just the sheer number of the projects that we have kept, we have studied, and we have documented in complete way. And it's with all these numbers that you can have an overall view of what's the reality of the built environment in Muslim societies throughout the world. As just you saw earlier, we've given awards. We're giving, every cycle, and up to now we have got 128 projects that we won the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. The last cycle was in 2022. And they are spread, as you can see, all over the world, and in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, and Turkey. We haven't had anything in South America or America and Australia. Probably they could be coming soon. The other aspect which I have to mention is that we celebrate these winners, usually in a very important ceremony somewhere in the world. The reason is that when you celebrate architecture at the highest level in a country with politically, you bring the subject of architecture to the people to be talked. Because if you want to have an impact, to have a better built environment, you need to change the mindset of the decision makers, the ministers, the officers, the developers. And if you have the more important your ceremony is, more people will be aware of what's happening. And that's how we've been celebrating all our winners. Now, very quickly, we've got it's a 3 years process. We have the nominations, and then we have to document the projects. The jury meets, they select 20 projects out of 400, like this time, which was said, 460 something. And then we announce the shortlist, because sometimes even if we have sent an expert to talk to everyone in the field, maybe there are some reality, some truth about some projects which is hidden. But when we announce them, and it's public announced, all these things, thanks to the social media today, it will come up. The jury meets again and they choose the winners, and then we go and celebrate with the winners their projects in their own home countries. This is a 3-year cycle which have been happening since 1977, And now we're entering the 16th cycle, which will be in 2025. Now, very briefly, I'm going to give some examples now about the projects which were shortlisted and the winners of these projects. Then later, after this, going through these, I will try to explain to you some of the rationale of how the jury works, how the jury has been doing, what they're looking for. Although it's not that rigorous, but this is my way of looking at them. And then at the end, maybe then ask you that maybe by these examples to look at them at the end of these sessions, you go back to some of these projects with all the information which exists, and you find out how can we really look at a good example in architecture anywhere. In 2022, the jury gave awards to 6 projects. This is only 6 projects. We have to look at them with the other 14 projects shortlisted. So the totality maybe is the best way to look at the society today, the world today. And maybe some of them are small projects, but they've got big impact. Now, before I go further, I just want to stress on one issue. As an institution, when you create an institution, how you want to guarantee that the outcome of that institution, what's coming out, it's relevant to its time. So that is I think one of the most important things that His Highness has been able to do is that by having a rotating steering committee, every 2 years, the steering committee members, they change, and the jury which change also all the time, we are always have been able to become relevant to at our time. So the issues, when someone goes, especially historians, they go back and look at the award for the winners of the Aga Khan Award for architecture, they can see that each time projects were selected that although they have been built much, much earlier, but that they were answering a number of questions of that time. Now, there is one thing one has to understand between the reality of architecture. The ideas in architecture, that the time that some ideas come to one's mind, by the time that those ideas are completed and done, sometimes in countries it might take 10, 20, 15, 20, 25 years, because the architects have an idea. Those ideas then has to go to be to people who are going to put the money in, the government or the developers. Sometimes it takes a long time to be completed and to be evaluated. So when you look at the project at the time it's been given, the idea is already old. It's a little bit old. So how we can find new issues, contemporary issues in projects which are done. And that's one of the things which the Aga Khan Award for Architecture has been able to do through this kind of system of changing the jury members and steering committee members. I'm going to give you a short description of each of these projects. And I just want to mention that you can go and watch 3-minute films on each of these projects on YouTube and internet everywhere. It's available, which gives you an in-depth story of the project. Now, the first project which was given an award, they're all equal, the 6 are equal. It is an abundant brewery in Tehran, which it was half demolished, and the architect, they have put what they call it a top on it, and a concrete roof on top of it, and turned it into an art gallery and a museum. It's kind of an art gallery museum, which is in the center of Tehran and has become now extremely a public space used by all the young people around. This is how this issue makes the whole important. It shows the importance of how we should take care of our recent heritage. The recent heritage, what's called the modern heritage, is also something quite new. It's coming all over the world, and we have a lot of good examples of the architecture of the 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, which are a part of our heritage. The heritage is not only the mosques built in 15th century or the forts and etc., which goes back to history. Recent history, or recent heritage, also an important part of one's memory, and it plays an important role in the collective memory of a society. The second project, which is in the same lines, is that the very famous Oscar Niemeyer, the Brazilian architect, he built in many places around the world, but he built also in Lebanon, and a project that it was never completed. And this project today, which was abandoned for many years, has been turned into a very active place. One part of it, it's not the whole complex, but one part of it, there are workshops for an NGO which works with the carpenters of Tripoli in Lebanon. And so how you can see that the buildings can change the uses, we call it adaptive reuse, but it can be in services because all of these structures can last for a long, long time. So this is another project which has been awarded this cycle. Another issue which is very important is the refugees. We have the problem of refugees. It's something you cannot avoid. And as all of you might know, in the past few years, in a matter of a month and a half, 1.5 million refugees had to go to Bangladesh, the Rohingya villagers. And usually there's a policy for all refugee camps all over the world that you should not build anything which is permanent, because you should not relocate the people. People, when you call the word refugee, they're going to go back. So all the structures should be very temporary. But how can you make infrastructure and all these areas there? So here we've got, by the work of a number of young architects with BRAC, which is a very important NGO, they have been able to build a series of different architecture styles in different camps, that these are refuge for specifically the women. The women of these camps, these refugees, but also they were active in building this, these buildings, but they're all built in materials that can be reused and in bamboo and mud. So this is the activities of these architects in such a short period of time to be able to create something which visually also is very important, because as you've seen, all the refugee camps, they're not something which we attempt, are very tempting, but they have been able to do that here. Again, in Bangladesh, there is another notion which actually you're going to hear him later, the architect talking to these Bangladeshi architects, is the activism. That how you can go and work in the country and the societies. Here in Bangladesh, in a small city, two architects, a couple, they've been there, they're working with the people creating housing, and also they've been able to help the government to make public spaces for them, which didn't exist. And they have been helping how to because the architects can also bring to the know-how of getting the funds, getting the project done together, and creating the projects. And here they've created a public space for this city, which didn't have anything at all. The other project, which is of big importance, is that what we call the green. People love to call it a green airport. Airports usually are where you have always a limitation between what they call it the air side and the land side, and today, all airports are shopping malls. So here in Indonesia, they came up with the idea that they needed smaller airports to spread it, spread especially tourism throughout the country. And then they had seen that how, when you talk about ecotourism, but if you go to these airports, which are all, anti whatever they are, they're not green at all, what would be the impact? Here, this is an airport which is done by an Indonesian architect, and he has there's one thing inside. There are no shops. You cannot buy anything. Everything you have to go out to the villages, everything around. So this is not the kind of shop. It's just a place to come with, and you come through and you feel the country. And it's been so successful that the president of Indonesia has been orders to make much more of these kinds of these type of airports throughout the country. And architecturally, It is very, it's inspiring. It has been, the architect is inspired by the local architects of the neighborhood. And that's how you can see that it's blending, how it blends in the paddy fields, this building. The last project which I'm presenting here is a project in Senegal. A group of young architects and volunteers from Barcelona, they went to Senegal and they felt that they can help by bringing money and raising funds to build a school which is permanent, using the local material. And they designed and built the school with the local material. And with these innovations, they've also helped teaching others in the area how to build and how to use the water, which is scarce coming, use the breed, the natural breed, etc. So something which is quite fit there. Now, you saw these projects and you come and say, what is the common line between all these projects? How the jury sits down and decides on all these projects? What is the criteria of the jury? Now, one thing is that juries do not have a set criteria. What happens is the steering committee of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, they give a brief to the jury and they say, these are the issues that the Muslim world is facing today. These are the environmental problems that we have. This is what the architecture needs to look at. They only put it this way. They don't make any limitation. We don't say categories. We don't have any categories that we want one housing, one, I don't know, airport, one. It's not by categories. What we're giving, we just give them all the projects and let them decide. So I looked in one of our books in 2010. The jury, during the discussions, they were writing down all the words, let's call them, the interesting words. I don't know how, I don't want to use any subjective for that. That these are the ideas that for change. So what is architecture? Architecture is that you're doing something to change the status quo. That's the whole thing. That's all. You want to do something, and it's by construction and architecture changing. So as you say, architecture is if you go to the desert and you just move one stone from one place to the other. That is architecture because you made a change. So what are the ideas for change which are very important? In 2010, the master jury, these are the number of areas that we're talking about, which they wanted to look at all of these in some of these projects. You cannot have all these ideas on one project, but there are certain ones which are very important out of them. For example, translation is very important. How can you translate the ideas and the wishes of a society into something very concrete? How you can intervene in that? What kind of negotiations you need between the different actors, between the people, the people who've got the power, the designers, the builders, all of them. These negotiations play a very important role. What are the new roles? So these are all the things that they were looking at them. So by looking at all the previous projects, 122, one can identify some criteria for excellence. As I said, these are never said to the jury that look at these. This is something that we're looking back at them, the projects and having them. And one is process, the use of resources, its identity, innovations, and lessons learned. These are the 5 elements which I'm going to elaborate a little bit on them. And what is the process? The process is the relationship between the client and the architect, builder, and users. This is very important how to do it. But what you have to do is that how you can respect every person and how you can persuade them that what we're going to have these ideas is good for you. I'm using here an image, which I loved it. This image is that when in Bangladesh, they went to two German architects, they went to build a school in the north of Bangladesh. And there, they usually built in mud and everything is swept away. they introduced how to use bamboo and how to make a big span with the bamboo. So the villagers and the carpenters, they didn't believe that they can have a big classroom with a truss, a bamboo truss. So the German, which was maybe in this image is not easily seen, the German architect together, they built one truss. So they asked all the villagers to go and stand on it. And when they stood on it and they found out, no, it would not break, they believed in those people and what to do. So what is important is the process is something that you have to involve all the different people who are there in the process to make sure it's not something that you say that this is the best way I know as the architect for you, do what I tell you. The other important thing is the use of the correct way of use of resources. Now, first of all, I personally do not believe that only local materials what is important is what is available locally. No, you can bring in other things. You can use materials, but there are a number of things which is important. One is that you use whatever is available the best way. You try to see if you can build to last, and it's not something for just to finish the project and go. And you have to explain that what is the benefits and your analysis for the people. Now, I'm giving you an example of the famous architect Francis Carey. He did a school for his village, and because of the truck, they could not take with them beams, I-beams, etc., because cars could not go there. So intelligently, they found that they could find these metal rods that can be used as a space frame. So he brought in a technology which was unknown in that part of Africa. But by using the material that the people knew it very well, they created these forms that could be a new form of covering the building. So, and it became much cheaper because it was the pieces that you can is a junk iron, that metal that you can buy, and how can you better use it? So this is how the best way that you use your resources. Another issue which becomes very important, and later in the courses I think you'll be talking about it, is the identity. First of all, is one has to believe in multiple identities. There is no one identity which is there, which is, everybody has to look at them. If one believes that identity is constantly evolving, you can see that how it's worked in architecture has to do something that's going to be a bridge between the past and the future. Why? Because when you build, as we just said, when you build something, you're not building for that moment. You're building it for a much, much longer time. So what is important is that we don't base on nostalgia, because it's just to give you an example, in 1983, a mosque, which you can see here in Visoko, in the village of Visoko in the ex-Yugoslavia, was built. And it did not look like a mosque, if you want, because it was very alien. But now, after 40 years, when you go there, I was there some years ago, this is the place that everybody feels a part, that this is their identity. This is the modern identity of that, the young people in Visoko in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then the last thing is the sense of belonging. It means that you feel good when you're in the space, in a building or a public space, or you feel that building belongs to that place. Here there is, I've given just an example. In Copenhagen, there is a very famous project called Superkilling, which got an award some years ago. The reason that it got an award is that it is a space, it's an area of Copenhagen, which something like 60 different nationalities, they live there. They're not slums, but they are lower income areas of the city. That's why that usually refugees, when they come to any city, they go to the cheapest parts of the country, the place. And here, when they came here, the architects, the artists, and the landscape and the people, what they did, they involved all these people, all these different societies. So they asked them, each of them, to bring something from their place, from their identity. And they brought it from, I don't know, someone, a fountain from Morocco, or a bus stop from Uzbekistan, and that is how it worked. So the other thing is that we're talking about is very important, is innovation. Innovation is extremely important, but innovation, it doesn't mean that whatever is new and good. What is important is that you have to solve problems. Solving problems is something which is, you have a problem and you have how best you can do that. And the skill transfer, these are the three moments. Now I give you a very small detail to see that how one can make these changes. This is a high rise in Singapore, which got an award. So what did the architects do? The architects, by only bringing back a very traditional way of what they call the horizontal windows, they introduced this horizontal window, which was something very local. They brought it to in this building. So this helped them have less air conditioning. So because of less air conditioning, they had more spaces. They were able to sell better the apartments. So it became an innovation which was done better for the developer as well. And at the end, I'm talking about the lessons learned, is that how we can learn lessons and to make sure that what we do is something we can use for later. And we will make sure that we don't have the missed opportunities, which are very important. We are careful not to have missed opportunities. This is a very interesting project for me, that in the city of Nicosia, as you know, Nicosia is split into two parts, the Greek and the Greek part and the Turkish part area. And they had one project together. They knew that one day they will be together. And the day that they finished the project, after a while, in few months, the Turks and the Greek Cypriots, they had a court, but as the project was ready, they just opened it and the city became one in a few days. And that was because of future. Now, you can go and look at these projects on all of them. And I would be interested to know at the end that, can you see all these criteria which I talked about in the project that you will see you will find them on the internet as examples of the 120 projects that won an Aga Khan Award for architecture. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Farrokh. And thank you for challenging me on the term Islamic architecture. And actually, Farrokh is right that what we're really looking at is the architecture of societies in which Muslims have had or have a significant presence. And I mean, the examples that we'll see in this course are not geographically limited to areas that Muslims are a majority. In fact, they're also a historic majority, because we're looking at examples in Europe where you might not think about the architecture of Muslim societies by looking at buildings in Europe, but Muslims are a very significant community or have a very significant presence in Europe as well. So the other thing which I'll reflect on, which I think is very significant in what you're showing us, is that many of the buildings and the projects that you show us are not inform the sorts of projects that people might immediately think, oh, this is connected to the heritage of the Islamic world, of the so-called Islamic world. Many of the things that Farrokh was showing, and many of the ideas, many of the challenges, many of the opportunities are related to issues of practicality, of function, of economy. And I think that one of the things we're keen to do in this course is to make you think of architecture in a deeper way than what does something look like, or does it have patterns that come from medieval Syria, for example. And I think that in thinking about architecture and design, I think people have done that across millennia. What you're first thinking about is, how am I creating spaces and places where people live? And how do those spaces and places function? And in this case, we spoke about the idea of the exemplary. It's how do these spaces and places function in ways that go beyond the ordinary, and think of new ways or old ways that actually make a difference. Of the airport that Farrokh showed, for example, which is much more conscious of energy use, or the skyscraper, which uses the traditional form of window, that means that you don't need air conditioning. So I think that a lot of what we're looking at is how have people delved into their context, whether it's their past or their geography, and come up with things that provide intelligent solutions. And I mean, one of the slides you showed, Farrokh, of these high rises in the distance, and also poor or kind of slums, reflect a reality that is very common. I mean, a widespread reality, not only in societies with a significant Muslim presence, but all around the world, where actually one of the challenges of architecture and design is how do we really create functional spaces where people feel comfortable and feel happy to exist. And I think that the Aga Khan Award for Architecture is a very good example of an entity that has championed that cause of looking beyond the skin of things into the real meaning of architecture and design, and how can it be exemplary in that sense. I mean, so Farrokh, I think, one thing I'll ask you is just to reiterate before we look at what questions the people who have signed up for this course are posing is, what were the main issues when the Aga Khan Award was founded that the award sought to address, and do these issues still exist?
The issues are the same. You see, the whole thing is that how you deal with changing societies and how you can come up with the aspiration of the young people. Today, first of all, they're not remedies that you can do everywhere. Every single country, every single place has got the same thing. But there are certain things which are very important, that the understanding of the context. Because the majority of the people, I mean, you could see that especially as I come back as after World War II, with the famous Marshall Plan and so many other plans, there was all of a sudden the world, they were saying that if you go this way, you will become like us. Means we are the only one know how's the best to do thing. But that is not true for many places. That's why that you can see the local solutions, how they do help a lot. When we were looking at, for example, when they came up with this brilliant idea of the microfinance in Bangladesh, that how they can help the people become house owners, the poorest of the poor. But these are all initiatives which come from the need. And the most important thing is that how to best understand the need. There are one of the things which we have the schools of architecture, they usually teach the good schools. You don't need to be from one place to do best solution from that place. If you know how to do the analysis, you can become very productive and go to a totally different place in the world and do something for that place. Today, one is something which is very interesting in Africa. You can see that the examples of what is called the colonial architecture, some of them built by in the tropical areas, the solutions that it was done by the British, a number of British architects and others in Africa was much better than all the ones that the local ones did. But it was interesting. It was much better than those people, the same architects from those countries who went and they got educated outside in Europe, in America. They went back to build. They made the same mistakes because they did not understand that they have to understand the context and build for the space. So that is what is just saying that one is that you don't need to be from the place to do it, but you have to understand that context. And I think that understanding, the time that you spend on understanding in a context is very important.
But do you think that issue, like the idea of identity or celebrating the identity of a place or of a society, or a community? Do you think that that is a more widely understood and widely appreciated idea than 50 or 70 years ago, for example?
Absolutely, absolutely, because that's why you can see today there's a big change. First of all, there were different phases in these societies. You could see in some societies that at one moment in the major cities, you know it very well, in Cairo, in Istanbul, in Beirut, in Baghdad, in Tehran, and a lot of places, that one moment there was traditional parts of the cities, and people then all of a sudden decided everybody wants to go to the modern, the so-called modern neighborhoods. And then after a while, there was kind of this nostalgia to go back and restore and get those areas become more important, has become a trend. This was not the case and that was the reason they were all abandoned. And now you can see that sometimes it has happened into gentrification because those same old cities, they have changed hands, changed people, and maybe we have to come with other solutions. But people are becoming more proud of that. And as I said, again, we can see now, this is very recent, the past 20 years, that the recent heritage also has become important, something which was totally neglected and just marginalized.
So would you say, I mean, just reflecting on all of what you're saying, would you say that part of what the Aga Khan Award does and aspires to do is to enable people to see value in places and in things which were overlooked?
That is one of our major goals, to just, as I said, because you cannot only have impact on architects, that's not enough. A lot of bad projects, the reason that they exist because they had a bad client. It's not because of a bad architect. So bad clients are one of the major responsibles for what is bad. Sometimes we've seen, unfortunately, even in some of these countries, about like ministers, etc. They come and say, I want a building like this. And sometimes some architects, they've got the ability to say no and don't do it. But architects also are their work. They're not, they have to do something. So they build it. And at a number of times, projects are taken away from architects and are completed by someone else. See? So this is also a process that has to be done. So the award is trying to have an impact on all levels of society. Let me give you an example. One of the things we do, we go back to each country and we celebrate the projects with the people of the project, people involved. I remember when for example, we went to the school, which I showed, the Bamboo School in Bangladesh. All the children in the school, they were so important for them because they saw that people are coming from the capital city because of their building. So they became proud of it. When they become proud of it, they keep it better. We were in Turkey and we went to a factory which got an award. And we had some of the researches was done that factory had a better production than other factories, neighboring factories, because of its architecture, because it's such a good place to work. I mean, the workers are much happier there. That was, they had some people had done that. But it was very interesting when we went there and we celebrated with the workers in the factory. And they became aware that their building is different, internationally known, than the other factories. So they themselves become responsible for where they work. It's not that they will just destroy it. See what I mean? So this sense of belonging, and it becomes very important that something belongs to you and you belong to that.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to open the floor to questions which will guide the next 20 minutes or so that we have of the session. And so there's a question actually about the idea of aesthetics. How do aesthetics commonly associated with Muslim societies and architectural principles as well shape the Aga Khan and what it looks to recognize and to celebrate? I mean, is there a certain set of aesthetic value that the Aga Khan Award sees as important or not?
I mean, that's what I was trying to show. I mean, I didn't show that many slides, but the aesthetics of, if you want, I had probably in one of the images, the Petronas Towers and this hospital in Mauritania. They've got very different ways of looking at it. The worst is the pastiche. The worst is the pastiche, which was happening for a certain period of time, that and actually, unfortunately, misunderstood, especially in the 80s, under the name of postmodernism, that you would build a building and you just put a facade on it. And that facade had some forms. And today, sometimes in some countries, you can hear that the governments, they make these regulations that you have to do, for example, these kinds of, on your buildings, on the facades, these kinds of windows of this and this, if it's done, I mean, as I say, this always is not a good idea, because it creates some homogeneity maybe in certain places that people like, but it is fake. It doesn't reflect the reality, because if you leave people to innovate, they will come up with forms which are belonging to that society. And yes, if you want to build something in Florence, in Venice, for example, it's very difficult. But even when you go to Venice, which is a protected place, you've got a number of modern buildings which they are blending into the system. So the whole thing is how you blend and how you work within that context visually. The words are always the eyesores.
We have one question about materials, which is many of the examples that you showed actually show local and inexpensive materials. And is that something that's hard for people to accept as being acceptable within modern architecture?
The building materials is it's something which sometimes the industry has not been cooperating well, because in Egypt, I'm just, for example, giving the example of Egypt. In Egypt, if you want to build everything in mud brick, all that fertile land will be, I mean, you don't have that much earth to use it for the buildings. You need it for agriculture. That's why that, it's the same thing. You cannot do it everywhere. In Africa, for example, in certain places, the wood, you can't use the wood. It's local, because you're just destroying the whole nature if you want to use all the wood which exists in the society. So you have to come up with alternative materials in certain places. That's what I was talking about, the intelligent way of using the resources. Using resources intelligently, because a lot of materials can be very good. And what I insist is innovation, new techniques and technology. Advancement of technology is very important. So you've got ways to do reinforced, for example, mud or clays or reinforced wood work, stones, etc. So you can use build it with the same material which is available, and built it correctly. So this is the same thing that when we're talking about sustainability today. We are not only talking about if concrete is bad for the environment or not. The whole thing is how it's produced, how much energy you need to bring something from somewhere to another place. All these things have to be taken into consideration to make something sustainable. So that's the idea of sustainability and appropriateness. Maybe the word that we should stress on is appropriateness. When it's appropriate, it means that it deserves, because sometimes, as I said, some new materials can do marvels in traditional societies.
Thanks. Okay, well, what about the role of governments? I mean, how important are governments in shaping the architectural and urban design realm? And can you think of examples of particularly enlightened or exemplary governments in that respect that who drive?
There are a number of issues with governments. Is that the one is that there are different governments around the world, different governances. Some of them, especially the more democratic governments are, sometimes the shorter period of the time the same person is in charge. Mm-hmm. So they want to do a number of things very quickly to show that they've been achieving, etc. So that long-term visions are less dominant. The other places sometimes is that the power. A lot of countries also sometimes, in a lot of places, architecture is used something as a symbol of power. So you build to show your power, and that's what some governments do. But a number of governments, they have understood that you have to be able to, because as I said, again, it's an approach to that specific government, how they do it. Like in the 50s and the 40s, 50s, 60s, building schools for a lot of developing countries was a big, important issue. So what they used to do, there was in each country, there were 4 or 5 different plans for a school, regardless of what is the climate, what it is, how it is. You had to only use those 4 or 5 plans. That's how the school. That's why all the schools looked alike. And a lot of these schools today, they're just, people don't feel good. They're just being torn down, or they're not used anymore. So that's why that adaptability and being able to be relevant to their time for the government is very important. But also, if I would put a little bit the other way around, it is the architect's role also to convince them, to show that there are other ways to do things. Because if you show they know how to express your project, which this will be better, I don't think any government would be against doing a project which is better for its society, because they would get the credit at the end. But again, coming back, the major architects, especially the big plans, they are the worst for the country, because all of a sudden, without noticing, they want to change, make a new neighborhood or make a new road, etc. I was together with SAFE in Saudi Arabia. We were going to give a talk, and then I was looking at the projects. I showed that projects in the presentation. A hotel built in Saudi Arabia by Fry Otto and people Goodbroad many years ago, and it was very important for the country, that project. By one mistake, they wanted to make a road. They demolished the building, but then they decided to change the road, so they didn't make the road there either. So these things happens, but let's hope for less.
I hope so. Okay, so actually, there's a very relevant question to that, which is contemporary architecture, in your view, as much about converting spaces as building new ones? And the person asking says, I'm thinking of the German concept of Umbau. Are there examples? Can you mention particularly eye-opening examples of converting spaces for new purposes in your breadth of
First of all, one of the big differences between Europe and especially Europe and the rest of the world is that in Europe, with the population growth, we don't need that much buildings anymore. The need for more spaces are becoming less and less, comparing to the societies which the population doubles every so many years. So you need more space and you need more places. So also adapting those the buildings to whatever exists today. I'll give you an example of Geneva, Switzerland, where I live. Some years ago, they, like many other countries, cities and countries, they gave permission for the buildings, especially the buildings built in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, to be able to add 2-3 floors above. Even in London, Hanifton has done something which is even 11 stories on top of another building. So first it was seen about how can you do that? But now when you look around the city, you can see that how by recalculating the structure, having new material, they've been able to better use these urban spaces because the infrastructure existed, the roads existed, but because of some regulations that they had at that time and the capability of the technology that they had, they could only build, let's say, 6 stories. And now all of a sudden, they've given them the right to build another 2, 3 stories, and they are how you say, because of the new techniques and technology, they are capable of doing it. So, I mean, this is simple. It's housing or more offices, but it is very important how to reuse them. The only thing is that, unfortunately, in most of the places, the first thing that comes to people's mind is that we convert anything to a culture center. How many culture centers and museums you need in each city? That's not the case. Sometimes we can come back. Recently, not the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, but the Aga Khan Development Network, one of the other organizations of the Aga Khan, we had restored in Zanzibar a historic building, which was an old dispensary. When the building was very important in Zanzibar, it was restored, but it was used as office buildings for a while. They wanted to have some commercial works. It didn't work out. Because the Aga Khan health services, they needed a space. So just last month, they inaugurated once again that building, which is central in Zanzibar, has become again a clinic. And I think that is, back clinic. It's not a reuse, it's the same use it had before, but they could adapt it. They had new machinery, they had they had to make only a few small changes to bring one big CT scan because it didn't fit into the door. They had to do something to bring it in, but they've done it, and it's just back to its original function.
So in short, I mean, there is a great deal of thinking about reusing and continuous use of buildings, either for new purposes or sometimes for their original purpose.
Yeah, you know how many mosques, how many churches are for sale. They can become a lot of things all in some countries because nobody uses them.
Well, thinking about, I mean, say the last 10 years of the Aga Khan Award, are there any particular projects that you think are exceptionally creative in thinking of reuse?
As I said, we had 3 projects this year in the shortlist, so 2 of them won an award. We had many examples of in our shortlisted projects and the winners of adaptive reuse. As I say, it was not only that brewery or the Niemeyer houses, but there were other examples we have had before as well, and they were mostly quite successful.
Okay, well, let's choose one of the ones you mentioned. Say the Niemeyer housing, the unfinished one. What do you think was so successful about it?
First of all, it gave hope. It has given hope because the Niemeyer's guest house, it's only one small portion of a very large compound. So by doing that, they showed that it's an exemplar, that if we do this, the rest can work. And now this is a very specific project because it's very important to the citizens of the Tripolians, the people of Tripoli. It's very important, that's building to them. And somehow, because of the importance, they did not come and because they wanted to do housing in it because it was a strategic place. But now they've stopped that, and they can see that they can use it for other purposes. And hopefully other parts of it will be also restored and used in the future.
And what about the brewery in Tehran?
The brewery, actually, the story of the brewery is interesting because the brewery was built by nobody knows who is the real architect because there's an engineer, probably a German engineer, came from Germany in the 1910 or 20, built a brick brewery, which you have got everywhere around the world. In the middle of, then it was not right in the middle, it was a little bit of, at the fringe of the city. Later, in the 1960s, they had to evacuate because breweries make a lot of bad smell. So the neighbors, they told the people they had to move. So the owners, they did not need the money, so they kept the land. It's not huge land, it's just, but it's in a very central part of Tehran. So probably for speculations, he had kept the land. And then revolution happened, the owners had moved. So the neighbors, the building started collapsing, the roof. And the neighbors were coming and sometimes taking, borrowing the bricks to build their own building, or borrowing so it was becoming like a ruin till they could do it. They could manage to do something to keep it as, and a foundation, put the investment. They bought the building from the owner. The owner came himself from America and signed it. And now it's become an extremely popular place. What was interesting is that we're talking about the word adapting. Once you're doing the projects, a lot of things happens when you're doing the projects. In this case, for example, the architects, they had thought of a metallic structure to keep the roof in, right? You have a building which exists. The best way to do it, to put, pillars and etc. in metal. They started half of the building, but because of the sanction in Iran and that certain materials could not be imported, in the middle they had to change. So half of it then had it in concrete, reinforced concrete. But that adaptability of the engineers and the architect to be able to do it in the middle of the work, I think was very interesting. That you have to adapt yourself to the realities of the day.
And do you find that projects that win the Aga Khan Award for Architecture inspire other people to do similar things?
A lot. We've seen it in good and bad. Good examples, bad examples. When you look at schools, just imagine all the various schools around Africa has been inspired by Francis Kera's, for example, school. There's so many examples. There are restoration projects that have been a lot. We have also projects that because they won an award, the second phases went on. For example, in Tunisia, in 1983, the first phase of the Hafsia project was completed, but for some reasons, the government and the UNESCO, they were not giving the money to do it to the team. Once they received the Aga Khan Award for Architecture and they got the fame, then say, oh, this is a good project, so they've continued the second phase. And the second phase, after some years, got the award as well, because they did such a good job. So this has been some of the anecdotal impacts.
So I suppose it speaks to your point about recognition and giving things prominence that would otherwise go unnoticed. That
exactly.
An international award
is about
take you much more seriously.
That's true. That is what's about. That's how you mention someone's work. The people who are, because usually an award, people do not do a project to get an award. Maybe some people try to do that, but that's not true. What it is that you do something on your own which is good, and if it's good, someone else will come and recognize you. That recognition, I think, is very important. It's not, especially if the recognition is not from your own country, because you've got a lot of awards, national awards, which, if you look at them, usually it's the usual suspects and whose turn it is. So people are giving awards between themselves, right? So there are a lot of politics there. In the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, nobody can say there's any politics, that anybody can have any power to manipulate politics on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Farrokh. It's been a really fascinating session and a great way of introducing the course. And what we're going to do in the following 8 sessions is look in depth at examples, and then in conclusion, reflect again on what does the future hold and what could it hold. And so next week we have 2 interesting examples. Firstly, 2 brothers, Abdurrahman and Turki Gazzaz, who founded a studio and think tank called Brick Lab in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And secondly, Danny Wicasono, who's based in Jakarta. So we'll look at histories of modernities in two very different areas of the Islamic world, of the Muslim world, and think about this, what were these trends of building new things and thinking about modernity, and use that to then, in the third session, think about identity, which Farrokh alluded to briefly here. So once again, thank you very much for attending. And Farrokh, I hope you enjoy your stay in Athens, and thank you for making the time to be with us.
Thank you. Thank you.